My name is John Mendez. I am a budget and policy analyst with the New York City Independent Budget Office. I am part of the housing, environment, and infrastructure team. So everything that has to do with physical infrastructure is what I cover. And at the bottom, you can see my email. If you have any questions, any tips, any suggestions, any thoughts about this presentation or the topics that we'll be touching upon, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy and excited to have a conversation. So let's get started. Why did IBO write about slow buses? For those who are not aware, the Independent Budget Office is a nonpartisan city agency that provides data-driven analysis of how New York City races and spends money. Part of the work that we do is examining the city budget, taxes, major policy issues, and everything that has to do with the daily lives of New Yorkers. As part of that, we know that public transportation, and specifically buses, is a critical part of what keeps New York City moving. For many New Yorkers, including those who are with limited access to subway or for New Yorkers with disabilities, the buses are sometimes the only available method of transportation. So that's why a couple of months ago, we were interested in just taking a look at buses and trying to understand how people interact with buses on a citywide level. With that said, we started first by looking at whatever data was available on buses, but specifically bus beats. The reason for that being that there is this overwhelming, I call it a vibe, that New York City buses are sometimes slow and unreliable. And we're going to get it's not hard to hear that whenever you're in a conversation about buses, people say, oh, I've been stuck in a bus in the middle of traffic for a couple of minutes, that the bus should be moving. There's always stories about double parked trucks. And so the overall sentiment is that in some parts of the city, New York City bus speeds are just slow and unreliable. And this is actually backed up by actual data. So there was 2017, there was a report by the city's controller's office that found that New York City buses are running at an average of 7.4 miles per hour. Back then, this was called one of the slowest bus systems in the nation. And we were interested in this particular data set and data point. So what we did is we did our own analysis of just looking at the data available from the Federal Transit Administration, which has a lot of data on transit speeds and just transit data overall. And we found that this is actually the case. So when you look at average local bus speeds across major US bus systems, the New York City bus divisions are among the slowest in the nation. So as you can see on the right, you have the two different divisions within the MTA that handle bus transit. And those average bus speeds are at the lowest compared to other cities, right? So if you look at something like New Jersey Transit, which is the sister, I guess, of the New York City MTA, those speeds are significantly higher compared to New York City. With this said, this was our first look at this issue. We knew that this was something that warranted some investigation. And so we wanted to dig into the actual data that's available from the New York City, or not the New York City, but the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, on bus speeds. So we wanted to dig in specifically to that data set. Before we dig into that data set, however, I do want to point out a couple of the data sets that we used for the purposes of this report. We're going to be talking about a couple of issues related to buses, but everything that you see in this presentation is coming from a report that we wrote back in early 2025 that uses all of this data. And we looked at MTA bus speeds. This is a New York open data set, not a New York City open data set, but still it's just publicly available data. And we also looked at bus lanes. There's a data set by New York City DOT on bus lanes around the city. And we also looked at parking violation data that's also available in New York City open data. And we're going to walk you through how we used all of this before we talk about the results of our analysis. So to get started, the MTA bus speeds data set. So the MTA publishes a data set on bus speeds that's updated in a monthly manner. this is how that data set looks. It is extremely easy to use. It is super helpful, and it contains average bus speeds, total operating time, and total mileage for all bus routes since January 2015. You can break down this data by a couple of filters. So you can look at it by borough. You can look at it by type of day. So if you want to look at average bus speeds on the weekend or on the weekdays, you can look at local, SBS, and express buses. So you can do those comparisons. And you can also look at off-peak versus peak hours. So those are all filters that are included within this data set that the MTA publishes. And I want to highlight that this data set is extremely easy to use, super helpful. I invite everybody to explore it yourself. And we're going to get into some of the results of this data set and the analysis that we did in the next couple of slides. As I mentioned as well, we looked at MTA, New York City DOT data on where their bus lanes are located. So this is a data set that's updated on an annual basis. And what it includes is a data set with every single bus lane in New York City with data that says when those bus lanes were built, the direction of those bus lanes. It has a way to connect it to other data sets, specifically the Lion data set, if you're familiar with that. It has borough information. It has information of when it was built, the width of that bus lane. So this is an extremely helpful data set that we used when we were evaluating the progress on New York City building just bus lanes across the city. The one thing that I would include here is that this is a very easy data set to use. If you don't have access to GIS tools such as ArcGIS Pro, you can take a look at this in QGIS, which is a free and open source data set. We have access to ArcGIS Pro, so we use that. But again, this is also a very easy to use and easy to manipulate data set. The one thing I will include here is that as far as we understand, for the purposes of this presentation, and this will be important in the next couple of slides, this data set does not include a breakdown of protected versus unprotected bus lanes. And again, this will be important later on, but that is just one thing that we wanted to highlight, which is one difficulty that we had with this data set. But other than that, this is a great data set, and we're so happy that we have it available. And then finally, we're also going to be talking a little bit about parking violation data. So this is a data set that's coming from the Department of Finance, the New York City Department of Finance, which is a data set showing parking violations issued by the city on a monthly basis. It's a really interesting data set. It is broken down into fiscal years. So if you want to look at a historical trend of parking violations, you essentially have to download every single fiscal year. These are very big data sets, and it takes a little bit of time if you're looking at every single parking violations to combine and filter out a lot of the data. However, for the purposes of our project, we were only specifically looking at a couple of violation codes, so you can filter down that data from the violation codes. In our case, we used R in this work. We also just use R a lot at IDO. And so, again, an incredibly helpful data set with lots of information and lots of insight into how we're addressing parking violations across New York City. I apologize if there's any R coders on the chat. I am not great with R, so if this code gives you anxiety, I am so sorry for that. And yeah, so let's get started into the results. So a couple of caveats. We started this analysis by looking at average bus speeds during weekday bus trips during peak hours. We did this to avoid the variability in weekend and to filter out off-peak bus speeds, specifically because when most people are using the buses is during those weekday peak times. So this is when most people are familiar with this issue of slow and unreliable buses. We also wanted to account for the variability from the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruption that it had on just everything. And so we are comparing our bus speeds analysis with a pre-COVID-19 benchmark of January 2019. What we found using publicly available bus speed data from the MTA is that the speeds in New York City by trip type in January 2016 remains fairly similar to what was found by the New York City Comptroller in 2017. Express buses tend to be your fastest buses. These are your buses that are connecting people from faraway neighborhoods to the main commercial areas and main business areas in New York City. SBS buses are just a little bit faster than local and limited buses. This is particularly because these are routes that are designed specifically for efficiency, reliability, and speed, but they're not substantially faster than local and limited buses. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in the next couple of slides. But even then, if you look at SBS average speeds, they're still far slower than most US major bus systems across the nation, which is a significant issue. The main takeaway here, however, is that although there's a lot of variability in this data set, there's a couple of things that happened. Bus speeds overall remain relatively slow, particularly on local and select bus service, which is what most people are accustomed to. And even when you look at this data on a borough-wide basis, you can see that over time, bus speeds by borough have remained relatively flat or slightly increased, except for the early pandemic. So that rise that you see on the right, that on the figure to the right, that early rise in bus speeds, that is coming from right when the COVID-19 pandemic started. Ridership was very low, service was disrupted, and speeds overall went up because less people were out on the city. But as more people were returning to the city, returning to the office, and life was getting somewhat back to normal, bus speeds fell back to where they were. One thing that I want to point out here is that the fastest buses by borough overall are in Staten Island, which is a fairly car-centric borough. It's probably the least dense borough in New York City, whereas Manhattan, which is the sort of more transit-heavy borough and the borough with the densest streets, tends to have the slowest overall average bus speeds in New York City. I will also note that in this figure, you can see the average bus speeds do vary across the year. So it's not like up and it goes up or down and it goes down. There's some variability. So what we've seen is that the average bus speeds during the summer tend to be different from the average bus speeds during the non-summer months. So during the winter and during the spring, which is just a very interesting data point that we found. We also wanted to look at bus speeds by either weekday or weekend. The reason why we wanted to look at this is because the MTA has highlighted that ridership recovery post-pandemic to pre-pandemic levels has been faster on the weekends compared to the weekdays. So we wanted to look at that variability between weekends and weekdays. And what we found is that, yes, buses tend to be faster during the weekend trips, but only slightly. With the only caveat here, I would add that we only have 1 month data point in 2026, which is for January 2026 bus speeds. And as you can see in the figure all the way to the right, express buses tend to be almost 2.0 miles per hour faster on average. But again, for 2026, we only have 1 month. That's not super reliable, but we just wanted to point that out. Now, this is a lot of numbers. One thing that we found whenever we're looking at bus speeds is that we can get lost in like 1.0 miles per hour difference. But the underlying reality is that there's a lot of personal impacts to bus speeds. Bus speeds are just not numbers. They're a lot more. And so we just wanted to point out a couple of interesting data points, MTA bus speeds on that data set that we've been talking about for 2025. I will give 15 seconds to the chat. Does anybody want to guess what the slowest bus in New York City is? And I'll look at the chat for a couple of seconds. All right, I do see a couple of here, B44, M34, BX12, M34. Okay, so none of those actually. The slowest bus in New York City is the M57 in Manhattan. So overall for 2025, the slowest bus was the M57 in Manhattan, which is running at around 4.99 miles per hour. I think some people can probably jog a little bit faster than that. That's what's happening. When we think about the fastest non-express bus in New York City, so as I mentioned earlier, on average, the express buses tend to be the fastest buses across the city. But when you're looking at the fastest non-express bus in New York City, it's actually the S89, which is a very interesting bus that is going through, I believe, if I remember correctly, through the North Shore of Manhattan. And it's running at around 16.79 miles per hour. If you look at Manhattan buses, though, the fastest non-express bus in Manhattan is technically the M35. If I remember correctly, the M35 is one of the buses that's crossing two boroughs, so it's going back and forth. I think I'm remembering that correctly. I might not, but we wanted to say, let's look at the more traditional bus, which is a bus line that's running across Manhattan. And in this case, we'll give it to the M98 at 9.19 miles per hour. And then just the fastest bus in New York City, as I mentioned earlier, it's an express bus. It's a 724, which tops up at almost 25 miles per hour, around that. You might be interested in your borough. I know there's a couple of data points here, so I want to move relatively fast. But if you look at this little data points that we have, look at your borough, and you can see the fastest and slowest buses by borough that are non-express. One thing that I want to point out here is that the slowest bus in Staten Island is still faster than the fastest bus in Manhattan. So do with that as you will. And then finally, we also, for the purposes of this report, and you can actually read a little bit more about this in the actual paper, we did calculate highest average speeds gain between 2024 and 2025. And in this case, we found that the Q48 in Queens had the biggest increase in average speeds between the 2 years. I believe this is one of the buses that was changed during the Queensboro bus network redesign. Now, enough about numbers. I think people are interested in knowing about why buses are slow in New York City. The reality is that there's a lot of explanations, and there's no one right explanation. But we did identify 3 of them that we think make a lot of sense. So the most visible one and the most commonly cited reason as to why buses are slow is traffic congestions. This is specifically an issue in Manhattan, where the city is the densest and high levels of congestion can lead to just buses being stuck in traffic, specifically in the tourism zones and major avenues. For example, a data point from the MTA said that over 700,000 people enter the Manhattan Central Business District every single day, which has contributed to just overall travel speeds for all vehicles to decrease in Manhattan, but that also includes buses. So our first issue here is that we have a lot of cars coming into the Manhattan area and just overall citywide, just a lot of traffic. The other thing that we have thought about as an explanation is just a lack of bus lanes, dedicated bus lanes. So bus lanes are specialized or specifically designated travel lanes for buses to travel on, even when that roadway is congested. So imagine that you are in Fifth Avenue, for example, and there's a lot of traffic. In theory, if there's a bus lane, the bus can just keep going and not have to worry about that traffic. Major thoroughfares across New York City do have bus lanes, and we'll get into bus lanes a little bit later as well. But think about Fifth Avenue, 42nd Street. These are very busy roadways that do have a dedicated bus lane, and they do provide that opportunity for buses to keep going. And then finally, in our data dive, we did find that there's been a lack of bus lane and traffic rule enforcement across New York City. New York City DOT sets the rules for parking violations codes, and then the NYPD is responsible for issuing citations and enforcing those violations. We have a couple of codes that are important for the purposes of this point. We have failure to make a right turn from a bus lane, mobile MTA bus lane violations, standing in a bus stop, and then standing in a bus lane. And this makes sense now when you look at the next slide. What we did was we looked at that parking violations data set. And we looked at, well, over time, how has violations or the issuance of violations changed when it comes to bus-related enforcement? And what we found is that overall, since 2020, both bus-related violations issued have increased. So as you can see on the right, we have a sudden rise after July 2020, fiscal year 2020. And for a couple of those codes, violations have gone up. But for the most part, since 2023 or late 2023, violations issued have plateaued. What we found is that one important data set here is that codes 5 and code 12 are issued by cameras. So these are either cameras that are mounted on top of the bus lanes or cameras that are mounted in the front of an actual bus. So when somebody's blocking the bus lane, if the bus comes in and they take a picture of the license plate and then a citation is issued. And what we found, interestingly, is that the camera enforced violations have gone up more so than the officer enforced violations. The officer enforced violations are whenever a traffic enforcement officer actually goes behind your vehicles, gets their notepad, and writes a citation. What we found is that camera violations have gone up significantly compared to officer-based enforcement violations. This is by design. The MTA has been expanding their camera violation program, and they're planning to even increase it more over the next few years. So this is just an additional note on enforcement that we wanted to highlight. I will say, if you have any questions, keep asking questions. I will come back to them at the end of the presentation. So please don't hold on questions so far. Now, we've talked about why this is an issue, and we've also talked about just what the issue is. But we wanted to talk about how the city is approaching this issue and what they're trying to do to solve it. So the main thing that they're doing is the New York City Streets Plan. This comes from a November 2019 law that was passed by City Council. And this law directed the New York City Department of Transportation to develop and implement a series of 5-year transportation master plans that would integrate planning across the entire city's streets, sidewalks, and travel modes. In addition, part of this transportation master plan would include metrics to improve safety, accessibility, and the quality of city streets. The first 5-year plan was introduced in 2022, and it covers from 2022 all the way to 2026, and it's known as the Streets Plan. I'm sure everybody here has heard of this and has heard of some of the issues with meeting some of these mandates, and we're going to get into that. But overall, what this local law does, outside of just unifying planning across the entire city street network, is to set detailed benchmarks for DOT that they are required to meet down to the annual miles of protected bus lanes, protected bike lanes, total redesigned intersections, square feet of pedestrian space, and other criteria. What this means is that the city council specifically told DOT, you have to build X amount of Y, bus lanes, bike lanes, bus stops upgrades, pedestrian spaces, and more in the next 5 years. One of these benchmarks was to build 150 miles of protected bus lanes in 5 years. So in theory, and I will make a note, protected bus lanes are different from what we might imagine bus lanes are, and we'll get into that into the next slide. But in theory, the streets plan was designed to just, in the purposes of bus lanes and bus speeds, to just build more bus lanes across New York City and allow for buses to not have to deal with the issue of traffic. But this was a very big mandate for New York City DOT. So for context, 150 miles of protected bus lanes is double the amount of, back in 2022, the already existing miles of bus lanes overall across New York City. So what you're saying is you have to build double the amount of bus lanes in 5 years than you have built in 60 years since the first bus lane was built in New York City. So this is a very big mandate for DOT. And for the note that I was making on the difference between protected bus lanes and normal bus lanes are your paint on the roadway. It's those red lanes that you see almost all across Manhattan, whereas your protected bus lanes, for the purposes of Local Law 195, the streets plan, means either physically separated bus lanes. So as you can see here on the left, there is a physical separation between the roadway and the bus lane, or it has to be protected by a camera. So it has to have one of those cameras that I was mentioning on top in order to count for the purposes of the New York City streets plan. Now, you might have heard that DOT has been struggling to meet some of these benchmarks. Now, this is how, over the last 4 years, which is all that we have data for so far, this is the progress that DOT has made on most of the New York City streets plan benchmarks. I'm going to walk you through this, but we're only, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm really interested in protected bus lanes, but redesigned intersections was one of those benchmarks. DOT has exceeded that very quickly. Accessible pedestrian signals, intersections also very easily exceeded. Transit priority signals, these are super interesting. These are things that you put on intersections that as the buses are approaching, the light is smart enough to change from a red light to a green light, just to keep the buses running. So they're on track to meet that. Bus stop upgrades, there's a caveat here, and that is that they had some issues with the contracting for this, but they have been struggling to meet this benchmark. Pedestrian space, I believe they covered this benchmark on the second year of the streets plan, so they did some really good work on this. But when it comes to protected bike lanes and bus lanes, we're struggling. And so as you can see, in 2025, the fourth year of the 5-year plan, we've only built 44 miles of protected bus lanes, and we have to do 150. So it means that this year, 2026, we need to build 106 miles of protected bus lanes to meet this goal. How possible is that? I don't know. I'll leave it up to you to make that decision. But that isn't to say that there's no progress at all. So we wanted to look at bus lanes built across New York City, looking at that data set that I mentioned earlier in our presentation, and we did a map. And so I personally have a big passion for maps. Not great, but I love making maps. And what we found is that overall, Manhattan tends to have the highest density of bus lanes. So you can see on the right, that is a map of New York City, and all of those red lines are bus lanes that are actually built in New York City. And those blue lines are bus lanes that have been built after 2022, which is when the streets plan started. Now, I will make a specific caveat here. All of the blue lines that you see here do not automatically count for the purposes of the streets plan. As I mentioned earlier, there's no real way to track that in the data set, but we just wanted to see where DOT has been building new bus lanes overall. And then if you think about where New York City DOT is building more bus lanes, the Bronx and Manhattan have had the greatest miles of road covered by new bus lanes. And we're going to get into sort of a closer look so that you can see that. And surprisingly, Staten Island has not had any new bus lanes built since the commencement of the streets plan. So no new bus lanes for Staten Island. Sorry if you lived there. So mentioned, we wanted to zoom in so that you can have a closer look at the new bus lanes built in Manhattan and the Bronx. In Manhattan, you can clearly see investments in blue that are focused on areas that are highly traveled. So these are 3rd Avenue, 96th Street, and then the Lower East Side. And then in the Bronx, you can see investments in University Avenue, Hellman Parkway, and then East Gun Hill Road as well. These are only bus lanes, and again, not necessarily all counting towards the New York City streets plan, but just where DOT has been building new bus lanes. Now, why is the city struggling to meet some of these mandates? It's not a surprise to say that the city is not on track to meet all of the benchmarks established by Local Law 195 of 2019. And we did a lot of research on this, and we wanted to look at why is it that we're struggling to meet these mandates. And what we found is that DOT has multiple times stated that they cannot meet the requirements of Local Law 195 without several billions of dollars in additional funding and a significantly reconfigured agency. This is an argument that they've been making ever since the first hearing of this proposed local law back in 2019. And it's actually backed up by some data. So the City Council's Finance Division, when this bill was being heard, they estimated that to achieve the first 5-year master plan minimum benchmarks, so just to meet the minimum, DOT would require an additional $377 million in expense funding and around $252 million in capital funding, in addition to what they have now, between all of the fiscal years in which the streets plan would be active for. And so we did some data digging into this, and what we found, and we talk a lot more about it in our report, is that while DOT's expense budget and capital budget have increased, we believe that this growth is better explained by just overall general growth in city expenses rather than funding specifically designated for streets plan work. We've also heard, again, as you mentioned, budget and headcount numbers have not increased outside of just general citywide increases in patterns. We've also heard that for a lot of these benchmarks, the specific definitions as to what counts and doesn't count for the streets plan are very specific. So as I mentioned, like just painting one line of bus lane red paint on the street, that doesn't really count. It has to be protected. And so it may be the case, it is not, it may be the case that New York City DOT built 300 miles of bus lanes across the city, but if only 44 miles of them are protected, those are the only ones that count for the purposes of this streets plan mandate. And then finally, what we've heard is that there's just some opposition from elected officials and local leaders. It is not unknown to hear that X project on X neighborhood has been held off by concerns from city council members, community boards, and so they have mentioned multiple times that they just need more support from local elected officials and local leaders. Now, again, and this goes to my personal passion about this, buses are not just numbers. It's not just, are we meeting this mandate? Are we making buses faster? They have significant economic, social, and environmental impacts for the people of New York. So many people, visitors and workers, commute by public transportation, and this includes buses. And so what we found in just our review of literature that's available is that unreliable and slow bus service can make our central urban areas less attractive for economic development. And that can restrict those who don't own a car from accessing employment, services, and just from reaching our urban areas. And if you're an employer, it is very likely that you value people getting to work early or on time. And it is not hard to say that if buses are slow and unreliable, more people are getting to work late, and that might lead to people just losing their jobs. And then particularly for people that live far from other options that are not buses, so the subway, the ferry, you probably have limited mobility. And in many cases, the only way that you can move around is by using a bus. And so for a lot of folks, this can cause anxiety if your buses are not reliable. If you're standing up in a bus stop waiting for 20 minutes for a bus, this can cause stress and exhaustion. And we even found that on some studies, people have a perception of risk and public safety if they're standing waiting for a bus to come or just stuck in a bus for a long time. And then also, we know that this is an environmental issue as well. Buses stuck in traffic are idling, and this contributes to air pollution. And then when buses waste fuel moving around double parked trucks and navigating, stopping, moving, that can cause pollution. And although the MTA has done a great job in making some of their environmental goals a reality, it is still a concern here when it comes to the environmental part of this. And it's also in our analysis, we looked at data from the census, and we looked at data just from research that has been done at the New York City level. And what we found is that median income for those who commute to work using public transit tend to be a little bit lower than those who commute to work using personal vehicles. There's a lot of different things that are implied in this point. But even more specifically, we found that bus commuters specifically tend to have lower income than subway commuters and just overall New Yorkers who live in New York City. So this has significant impact on a group of people that are already facing a lot of issues, socioeconomic issues and obstacles as well. Now, I've been talking a lot, but I do want to mention that there's been a couple of updates since we published this report in February 2025. Congestion pricing started. This has many purposes, but one of the purposes was to try to speed up buses by having less traffic in the central business district. We found that the MTA has actually said that bus speeds have increased around 2.3% inside the central business district. So that's some progress. The MTA also, this was not available when we did our analysis, but they released a bus route segment speed dataset. And what this looks is at when we did our report, we only had average bus speed for the whole bus route. And this data set actually provides segments of that route and their average bus speeds. So it might be the case that, for example, there is a bus route going from Battery Park all the way to Inwood Park in Upper Manhattan. And while it might be the case that outside of Midtown, buses are extremely fast, in our initial analysis, if the speeds in Midtown were significantly lower, that would be reflected across the whole average speed for the purposes of our analysis. Whereas now you can actually see the segments of that route and the average speed for that segment, which is a huge improvement. And then finally, current mayor Sohran Mamdani has been sworn into office as the mayor of New York City, and he came in with a major campaign promises to make all buses free. So these are some of the sort of new developments in this area. And just to conclude, because I want to give some time for questions, New York City remain consistently slow. And while the streets plan tries to rectify some of the underlying issues impacting slow buses, the lack of progress in achieving some of these mandated goals indicates that problems of slow buses is not yet solved. It will not be solved in the next few months. So it takes time to do significant change in this area. And again, addressing the issue of chronically slow buses is very impactful for certain communities that depend on buses as their main mode of transit. And overall, a reliable and efficient bus network is an essential part of New York City's public transportation system, and is critical for the well-being of the city and the economic growth of the city and the well-being of its rider. Again, I want to stress that addressing this issue is particularly impactful for communities that depend on buses. This includes older folks, older New Yorkers, people with disabilities, people that live in areas without access to the subway. And there is a responsibility from the city to address some of these issues citywide. With that said, I just want to point people to some additional resources. Please visit our website. We have a lot of great work on policy issues and on buses, and we just have a lot of stuff in there for you to see. You can also look at my report. That is the foundation from which this presentation came up, which is Speeding Up Slowly. We also have an interactive version of that bus lane map with some additional data, and it's interactive, it's explorable, so you can click on it, you can zoom into your buses, and you can actually see your bus average speed. So I invite you to visit those links. They're all included in our website. And then I added a link to the MTA's metrics website, which has a lot of really interesting information specifically on bus-related performance metrics, including bus speeds and ridership and fare evasion. And then finally, there's a link to the latest New York City Streets Plan report. Please visit it if you're interested in seeing how some of these projects are going, some of the challenges, and just some of the specifics of the New York City Streets Plan. That said, I will take the time to answer any questions. There's a QR code. Please visit it. You can join our social media and our newsletter. So I am going to try to answer as many questions as I can. I know there's been a couple, so I'm going to walk through as much as I can.
John, I've actually been tracking the chat and sifting out the ones that either weren't fully answered in the chat or I think could. So I can basically relay them to you if that's helpful.
Perfect. Yep.
Yep. Great. Okay. So one question was, how was average bus speed calculated? Because there's two methods.
Yes. So as you saw in the original data set, for the purposes of our project, our analysis, we divided the total operating time by the total mileage, and that's what we use to get average speed. This is the recognized method to do it. It's how the Federal Transit Administration does it, so that's how we did it for the purposes of our project.
A related question to that was, do we know the standard deviation for the average speeds? Because the variability that we see between months might not be statistically significant.
I don't have that particular number available, but please put your email and we'll reach out with that data if you're interested.
This one was more of a recommendation. When you were talking about the reasons that buses might be slow, one explanation could be that it's the number of passengers that get on or off for every mile traveled. According to some data, New York City is the highest in the country. So did you have any comment on that, or did we think about that?
We did not include that in our analysis, but this is a really interesting thing that we did not look at, and I'm happy to do some digging. Again, this report is out, but I am personally super passionate about bus speeds, so I'm happy to take a look at this as well. I appreciate the suggestion.
Yeah, just actually for reference or for credit, Stephen asked all those three previous questions. So thank you, Stephen, for being active in the chat.
Thank you.
Related to that, Amy asked a question if there's been any review of whether SBS lines have slowed since switching to Omni, in the sense that you cannot pay in advance as you could with a Metro card.
That's an interesting question. It's hard to say. I would assume that what you're saying, your sort of logic makes sense, but it's not something that we specifically looked at in our report. But it's an interesting question, and we'll be happy to look at that as well. You can probably just look at the MTA metrics website that I linked earlier, and then specifically look at when Omni was fully implemented, January of this year, and the Metro card went out or such, and you can see the difference in average bus speed since then compared to prior months.
Stephen asked another question that I don't think we had a chance to look at this in our report, but how does bus speed relate to total trip time? Citing that New York City bus rides are among the shortest in the US.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is something that we've heard a couple of times. We've also heard that just bus stop distance is fairly short in New York City. It might be the case that by design, the way that the bus stops and the bus network is designed, this has an impact on bus speeds and is probably slowing average bus speeds down. So it's a very interesting point that we'll take into consideration for any post-publication review of this topic. So it seems like this is something that would have some impact into this.
Yeah. The next question is one that I know we've talked about, but haven't been able to look into it yet. From Ashwin was, has IBO looked at analyzing or quantifying reliability?
Yes, this is the question of sometimes I'm in the MTA app and it says that a bus is coming and it doesn't really come. So it's an interesting question. We thought about it. So when we were looking at this analysis, one thing that we knew is that bus speeds are important, but if the bus never comes in at all, then it doesn't really matter. We had some issues in sort of trying to understand how to better analyze that, just because it would require us to look at timetables. It would require us to look at whether a bus came in or not. So for the scope of our initial project, that was not included, but it is something that we know has an impact on this. If the bus never comes, then you suffer from the same issues and you're not counted as sort of bus speed. But it's a very important issue that we know has an impact on this as well.
Yeah. We got a question. Is there any analysis about the delay impact caused by fare evasion and the potential remedy of free buses as suggested by the Mamdani administration?
Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, just is there any analysis or do we have any thoughts about impact delays caused by fare evasion?
Yeah, you can probably, in that metrics website from the MTA, you can see that fare evasion has gone up significantly over the last few years. Specifically, I believe the fare evasion rate in local buses is at around 40 or 50% of all riders, which is a significant issue. Whether or not that has had a direct impact on bus speeds, it's just hard to say. There's so many variables involved. Probably if somebody's not paying the fare, they're getting in faster. But then again, it's just hard to make that association between the two. And on free buses, it's also a case where like we really don't know how fare-free buses would be implemented. If it's a slow rollout, if it's everywhere, we don't know how ridership would change. And so it's just one of those things where until it happens, we really don't know. There have been some analysis done on the private side, so I suggest you look at that. And there have been reports done by the MTA as a result of their fare-free bus pilot. So you can look at those for some insights, but it's just hard to say on a citywide level, if we made all buses free, will bus speeds increase? I think that's up to debate.
That was my question. If I elaborate anecdotal evidence, but on multiple bus routes, I have seen the crowding at the back door of people evading the fare while the front door sits open and empty. That's more accessible. So it's thinking about that because people do things in order to evade that seem to slow the buses down.
Correct. And I think if you also talk about enforcement, I believe in most places, the bus fare is not being enforced by the bus driver, but if a bus is stuck in a bus stop waiting for somebody to pay the fare or waiting for security or police to come in, that also has an impact. So it's just hard to say how much that impact has been, but certainly there is some disruption from fare enforcement and not paying the fare on bus speeds. And then I also see that there was a question and has gone up 50%. So bus fare evasion has gone up over the last few years, but right now it is hovering at around 40 to 50% of a fare evasion rate, essentially. What's the next question? So Aaron says, does parking violations indicate company if it's a company car? For example, I read that Amazon owns millions in idling fines, so I'm curious if it's possible to identify. So there is some ownership data on that data set that I mentioned, parking violations data set. I believe you can see by type of vehicle. So you can see if it's a passenger car, if it's a commercial car, but tying those specific violations to companies can be a little bit harder. And that is not something that's currently available using public data sets. And then, how did you get into this work? Did you have any objectives in mind in researching, compiling, and publishing reports on this topic? For us, it was just interest and the conversation about buses. I personally have heard, and I have been on slow buses as well, that buses are slow and unreliable. And so when thinking about what could we write about when it comes to buses, my main concern was that this is an issue that impacts a lot of people, and we should talk about it. And there's certainly things that the city could do or things that the city is doing to speed up buses. And so we just wanted to provide folks with some context as to what's happening when it comes to the streets plan, when it comes to efforts by DOT and efforts by other city agencies as well. I will also say there was this really good report at around the time this publication was being thought about by the New York Times about how for a lot of people in the airports, the only way to get to the airport is by a bus. And that report was getting into how a lot of these buses are very slow, they're unreliable, and how they cause a lot of anxiety for people that ride those buses and work in the airports. And so that for me was a wake-up call that this is something that like we should talk about because it's important and it impacts a lot of people as well. And then I do see a question by Mus. Are there any data sets available on dwell time for bus lines? That's an interesting question. I believe there might be. I'm sure the MTA has data on this. I don't know if they publish it. That is not something that we looked at for the purposes of this report, but it is probably something that's available. I would suggest that you look at that MTA metrics website to see if there's information there, but it's certainly something that you're aware of. Could the GPS data used for the segment speeds dataset be used along with the GTFS data to compare schedules with actual arrivals? Yes, I would assume so. That is something that's relatively new, that segmented bus speed data, so we could definitely take a look at it. I wanted really badly to have some work done on that, but it's just for the purposes of this project. That dataset was not released, but we have taken a look at that, and that's a great idea if we want to talk about reliability as well. So thank you for that idea. We'll note it down.